I didn't collapse at work like some dramatic scene you'd see in a movie trailer, with people shouting my name and a heroic slow-motion fall. Because if there's one thing I hated, it was being the center of anyone's attention, especially when I didn't have control of how I looked. I collapsed in aisle 7 between cereal and frozen pizza, wearing steel-toe boots that still had warehouse dust on them, holding a basket with 2 things that had turned into 12, because I'd walked into that store telling myself I was just grabbing quick stuff. Like I always did, like time was a tool I could keep tightening until it fit my day. The lights were too bright in that grocery store, harsh and flat, the kind that make everyone look tired, and I remember thinking, so clearly it almost makes me angry now, that I didn't have time to be there, and I definitely didn't have time to feel weird, because weird feelings were for people who had the luxury of listening to their bodies. Then my vision narrowed, not like darkness dropping suddenly, but like the world gently stepping backward from me, as if the aisle was stretching and the sound was being wrapped in cotton, and my hands went cold so fast, I actually looked down at them, waiting to see if I'd spilled something on my skin. I tried to take one breath that felt normal, and the air felt heavy, like it had weight, like my chest wasn't a place it could enter anymore. I remember reaching for the shelf without meaning to, because my legs suddenly didn't belong to me, and my knees folded like someone cut a string. Just picture that for a moment, standing in a normal store, with strangers pushing carts and making quiet decisions about snacks, and then your body quietly decides it's done cooperating, right there, right in front of freezer doors. The last thought I had before the floor came up to meet me wasn't poetic or brave. It was irritated. I actually thought, I'm too busy to deal with this. And then there was nothing. Before that night, if you looked at my life from the outside, you probably would have called it stable, even successful in a plain, working man kind of way. Because I was 41, I managed warehouse operations for a regional distribution center, and I was the guy people called when something broke at 2 a.m. or a truck showed up early and nobody knew what to do with it. I wore my job like armor, and I didn't realize it was also slowly crushing me. My days ran on caffeine and urgency, and I treated sleep like a negotiable expense, the way you treat an optional warranty when you're sure you'll never need it. And I didn't go to doctors because I honestly believed that if you didn't give problems a name, they couldn't get traction in your life. That sounds stupid written out like that, but it felt logical inside my head. My breakfast was usually coffee so strong it tasted like burnt pennies, and whatever I could eat with one hand while the other hand scrolled emails, because I was always behind, always trying to catch up to a day that had already started without me, and I took pride in that, which is embarrassing to admit now, because pride is a weird thing when it's built on neglect. At home, life was fine in the way people say fine when they mean functional. My wife, Laura, kept the house moving, not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, like she'd been doing it so long she could do it without thinking, and I was grateful in a way that mostly stayed in my head instead of leaving my mouth, because I assumed she already knew, because I assumed there would always be time. My son, Ethan, was 15, tall and quiet, and he lived behind his phone screen the way I lived behind my work schedule, and we'd started doing this thing where we shared space without really sharing life, because I'd come home tired and edgy, and he'd be in his room, and if we talked it was about chores or grades or something practical that didn't require me to be emotionally present. And my dad was the one I kept meaning to call. He left voicemails that started cheerful and ended careful, like he was trying to sound casual, while also reminding me that time was moving, and I would listen to them while driving, nodding like I was agreeing with him, telling myself I'd call back later, because later always felt like a guaranteed resource. Have you ever done that? Told yourself you'd make it right later, not because you don't care, but because you believe your life will always give you another opening? That's who I was, a man living like nothing could interrupt him. The ugly part is, my body tried to warn me, and it didn't do it in whispers so subtle I could claim ignorance, because it was more like a series of increasingly obvious taps on the shoulder that I kept swatting away like an annoyance. It started with stares. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing where you grab your chest and fall against a railing, but the kind where you reach the top of the steps at work and you realize you're breathing like you just sprinted, and you stand there a second longer than you used to, pretending you're checking your phone, when really you're waiting for your chest to stop feeling tight. There was this pressure sometimes, not exactly pain, more like someone had placed a heavy hand in the center of my chest and was leaning just enough to make it uncomfortable. and it would fade if I slowed down, which I took as proof it wasn't serious, because I was a genius at turning "it went away" into "it isn't real." A few times I felt it in my jaw, this odd, creeping ache that made me clench my teeth without noticing. And one morning I woke up at 3 a.m. sweaty, my sheets damp and cold, my heart doing something that didn't feel like a normal rhythm, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the hum of the house, thinking, what is wrong with me? Then I did what I always did. I swallowed it. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was too much coffee. I told myself 41 wasn't old, and besides, guys like me didn't just drop dead in grocery stores, because guys like me were useful, and useful people don't get taken out by something invisible. The symptoms didn't only live in my body either, which is something I didn't understand until later, because my mood started changing in ways that felt like the world's fault instead of mine. I got impatient with everyone. I got sharp with my team over small mistakes, snapping like a stretched rubber band, and I started getting angry at slow people, slow drivers, slow walkers, slow cashiers, like they were personally disrespecting me by existing at a pace that didn't match my internal engine. If you've ever been around someone like that, you know what it feels like, because they make the air tense without even raising their voice. Laura noticed before I did. She'd watch me rub my chest after carrying something heavy, and she'd ask if I was okay with that careful tone that means she already suspects the answer, and I'd wave it off, because in my head, admitting weakness felt like opening a door I wouldn't be able to close again. One night she said, gently, that I should get a checkup, just a routine thing, and I heard it as criticism, which is the kind of irrational arrogance only a scared person has, and I told her I didn't have time, and she looked at me for a long second like she wanted to say something bigger, something truer, but she didn't. Ethan noticed too, in his teenager way. He stopped asking me to play basketball in the driveway, and I told myself it was because he'd outgrown it, because that explanation hurt less than the idea that he'd learned not to expect me. And then there was my dad's voicemail, the one I listened to twice and still didn't call back. His voice was warm, but tired at the edges, and he said he'd been thinking about me, and he ended with, "Call me when you get a minute, son," like he was trying not to sound like he was asking for something important. Try to feel what I felt in those weeks, even briefly. The way you can sense something shifting inside you, something unfamiliar, and instead of turning toward it, you speed up, as if moving faster can outpace your own body. That's what I did. I sped up, and I kept telling myself I was fine. That Tuesday had been long in the way that isn't dramatic, just grinding, because a pallet shipment came in wrong. One of the forklifts kept stalling, and a driver showed up late with an attitude like it was my fault the schedule existed, and by the time I clocked out, my shoulders felt like they were holding the whole building up. I drove home on autopilot, ate something that barely counted as dinner, listened to Laura talk about something I should have cared more about, nodded at Ethan without really seeing him, and then realized we were out of a few basics, so I grabbed my keys again and said I'd run to the store, like it was nothing, like I was doing my family a favor by spending 10 extra minutes out there instead of being present in the house. The grocery store was busy but not chaotic, the normal evening crowd, people in sweatshirts and tired faces, carts squeaking, the beeping of scanners in the distance, and I remember the smell right away. Cleaning product mixed with warm bread from the bakery section, that strange combination of sterile and comforting that stores have at night. I walked in telling myself I needed two things, and then I started doing what I always did, which was treating errands like a mission, cutting corners, moving fast, scanning shelves with that impatient focus like the store was an obstacle course, and I was being timed. I got a basket, then added more than I meant to, because I saw cereal Ethan liked, then something Laura mentioned, then a frozen meal for work lunches, and I ended up in the aisle where you can see the freezer doors on one side and tall shelves on the other, and I was reading the back of a box like I had all the time in the world, which is the weird irony of it. How ordinary the moment was. The first thing I noticed wasn't pain. It was my hands. They went cold so quickly it felt like someone had poured ice water into my veins, and I flexed my fingers around the basket handle, almost irritated at my own body, like it was acting up for attention. Then my vision did something I can't forget, because it didn't go black right away. It narrowed. The aisle didn't disappear, it just pulled away from me, like I was looking through a tunnel made of fluorescent light, and the edges of everything turned dull and far, and I realized I couldn't quite hear the store the way I had a second earlier. Sound got weird. The beeping of registers felt distant, The wheels of carts sounded like they were underwater, and I remember swallowing hard, because suddenly my mouth was dry, and I tried to take a deep breath that would reset everything. Except the breath didn't reset anything. My chest felt tight in a way that wasn't a workout tightness, not a you climbed stairs too fast tightness, but a locked, heavy pressure that made the air feel thick, like it was pushing back when I tried to pull it in. For 1 second, my mind did what it always did. It tried to rationalize. I told myself it was a panic thing, even though I'd never had a panic attack, because labeling it that way made it feel less dangerous, and then I told myself I just needed to sit down, because sitting down felt like a solution. I took one step, then another, and then my legs turned unreliable, like someone had loosened every bolt in my knees, and the basket slipped in my hand because my grip wasn't strong enough anymore, and I remember reaching for the shelf with my left hand. Not for drama, for survival. My palm hit cardboard boxes and plastic packaging, and it didn't help, because my body was already folding, already giving up, and I heard myself exhale this short, sharp breath that wasn't even fear yet, more like confusion. I went down hard, not a graceful feint, more like my body was simply removed from the standing position, and the floor was cold through my pants, a hard, unforgiving cold that felt too real, too immediate. People noticed fast. I heard a voice say something like, "Sir," and then another voice louder, and footsteps that didn't match the slow grocery store shuffle. And I remember a woman's face appearing above me for a second, eyes wide, mouth moving, but the words didn't land. Everything started to blur into fragments. I saw the bright lights above, the long rectangular panels, and they looked too sharp, like they were the only thing still fully in focus, and then I couldn't feel my fingers at all, and my chest pressure shifted into something hollow. It's hard to explain, but it felt like the center of me was turning off. I tried to speak, because my brain still had this stubborn belief that if I could just say, "I'm fine," it would become true, but my tongue felt thick, and the attempt didn't make it out. Then there was a moment where I realized I couldn't control my breathing anymore. Not because I forgot how, but because my body wasn't obeying the command. And that's when fear finally arrived, sharp and clean, cutting straight through every excuse I'd ever made. Just picture this with me for a moment. Your brain fully aware, noticing the simplest things, like the texture of tile and the smell of cleaning chemicals, and yet your body feels like it's drifting away from you, like you're losing the ability to stay attached to your own life. Someone was kneeling beside me. I felt a hand on my shoulder, firm, anchoring, and another hand near my face, and I heard a voice saying my name, even though I'm not sure how they knew it, because at some point my wallet had been pulled out or someone had looked at something, and the voice kept repeating it like a rope being thrown toward me. "Stay with me." I didn't hear those exact words clearly, but I felt the intention behind them, the urgency, the human insistence that I wasn't allowed to leave yet. I heard an employee shout for someone to call 911, and then I heard the words "ID," like it was a code word that made everything move faster, and I remember the sound of something being dragged or carried quickly, plastic knocking against a cart or a shelf. Then the ceiling lights shifted, not literally, but in my perception, like the world was tilting. My hearing faded again, and the faces above me became shapes, and I remember thinking, in this weird, detached way, this is ridiculous. I'm in a grocery store. And then, in the middle of that, I felt something intimate and terrifying. Hands. Hands that weren't Laura's. Hands that weren't my son's. A stranger's hands on my chest, steady and purposeful, like they'd decided my life mattered even though they didn't know me. I remember the cold sting of air on my skin when my shirt got pulled up or unbuttoned, the embarrassment flashing through me for half a second, because my brain still cared about dignity while my body was failing. And then I felt sticky pads pressed onto me, firm and cold, and a voice very close saying something like, "Clear." There was a pause, a heavy pause, the kind where the whole world seems to hold its breath. And then everything snapped into a hard blank. Not darkness like sleep, not fading like fainting. A sudden, clean absence, like someone flipped a switch and the room, the floor, the lights, the sounds, everything was gone. There's a myth people like to repeat about moments like that. This idea that you see a tunnel or a light or some comforting image that makes death feel gentle. And I'm not here to argue with anybody else's experience, because I can only tell you what happened inside me. And what happened inside me was not comforting. It was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Not peaceful, not restful. Wrong. It wasn't even darkness like a closed room, because darkness still feels like something, and this was more like the absence of sensation entirely, like my mind had been dropped into a blank file with no sound and no picture and no air. And the worst part, at first, was that I didn't know if I was dead or alive, because I couldn't feel my body, and I couldn't feel time, and there was nothing to measure myself against. Just nothing. Try to put yourself in that for a moment, because it's hard to imagine until you've felt it, and I don't mean picture darkness. I mean picture your own thoughts echoing into a space that gives you no answer back, and then imagine realizing you might never come out. The first emotion that hit me wasn't sadness. It was anger. Pure, stubborn, offended anger, like my life had been interrupted without permission, and my mind kept saying, "Not here. Not like this. I have responsibilities. I have things to handle." It sounds ridiculous, but that's how I was wired. I'd built my identity on being needed, and even in that blankness my ego tried to stand up and argue with whatever was happening, like I could negotiate my way out of it. Then the anger cracked, and what came through underneath, it was shame, so heavy it felt physical even though nothing else did. Because suddenly, without warning, I wasn't thinking about work. I wasn't thinking about schedules or money or deadlines. I was thinking about the people I loved, and the sick part was I realized I'd been treating them like they'd always be there, like they were permanent fixtures in the background of my life instead of the actual point of it. That's when the memory started. Not in a cinematic montage, not in some organized life review, but in sharp, intrusive flashes that made my mind flinch. My dad's voicemail. I heard his voice in my head, clear as if he was right beside me, that warm tone trying to hide the tiredness, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd asked him how he was doing without also looking at the clock. I saw his name on my phone screen, that little missed call notification, and I saw myself swiping it away while driving, telling myself I'd call back later, because I thought later was a guaranteed resource. And in that blankness, I felt the full weight of what later really means, because later isn't a promise. It's a gamble. Then I saw Ethan, not as he was now with the headphones in the phone and the teenage distance, but as he was when he was little, maybe 8 or 9, standing in the driveway with a basketball under his arm, looking up at me with that uncomplicated hope kids have, the kind of hope that assumes adults will show up. I remembered the day he stopped asking. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was just a gradual fade, like a light dimming, but in that inner silence it hit me like a punch, because I realized he hadn't stopped wanting his dad. He'd stopped expecting him, and that realization carried a pain I didn't know existed until it was too late to fix easily. Then I heard Laura. Not a full sentence, not a speech, just her voice, strained and small, saying please, and the word didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a prayer. And that's when fear finally replaced shame, because I understood something that I'd avoided understanding for years. I might not be coming back, and if I didn't come back, my family wouldn't remember my love in the way I wanted them to. They'd remember my absence. They'd remember my impatience. They'd remember the way I walked through our house like a man passing through instead of living there. Have you ever had that thought? The one you don't let yourself fully have because it's too painful, where you realize people might remember you not for what you felt, but for what you did and what you didn't do, and how you made them feel when you were still here. Because that's what hit me. Not I'm going to die, but I'm going to leave them with unfinished love. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say I'm sorry to my dad, to my wife, to my son, to the version of myself that kept choosing later. But there was no mouth, no air, no body to form words, and I felt this helplessness that was almost unbearable, because regret without action is a kind of torture. And then, in the middle of that panic, another memory pushed in, sharper than the others. It was Laura at the kitchen sink a few weeks earlier, washing dishes, and she'd turned her head and looked at me with that tired, steady face, and she'd said, softly, "You don't go to doctors." At the time, I heard it like nagging. In that blankness, it landed like a verdict. Because it wasn't criticism. It was truth. It was her watching me ignore my own life. And I realized something that made my fear turn into something else, something more raw. My life wasn't being taken from me by bad luck. I had been spending it down. I had been draining it on purpose, one skipped checkup, one ignored symptom, one impatient day at a time, and I had called it being strong. Try to feel that shift with me. even briefly. The moment you stop blaming the world and you finally see your own choices as part of the story. That's when the blankness started to change, not into light or visions, but into sensation returning in tiny, brutal pieces. A distant sound, like a muffled beep. A chemical smell that felt too sharp. Pressure on my chest again, rhythmic and urgent. A voice repeating my name like someone was pulling on a rope. And somewhere far away, under everything, I felt the smallest spark of something I didn't deserve but wanted anyway. Another chance. The first thing I remember about coming back wasn't seeing anything. It was sound. A steady, insistent beeping that felt like it had always existed and I was just now noticing it. And underneath it there was a softer layer of noise. Air moving through a vent, footsteps that didn't rush, voices that stayed low like the building itself required calm. Then smell. That clean, sharp hospital smell that isn't one thing. More like a mix of sanitizer and plastic and something faintly metallic, and it hit the back of my throat in a way that made me want to cough. Except my body didn't immediately understand how to do that either. When my eyes finally opened, the light was dimmer than the grocery store, not harsh fluorescent panels right above me, but a softer ceiling glow and the greenish-blue wash of monitor screens, and for a few seconds I couldn't make sense of where I was. I tried to move, and the attempt barely happened. My arm felt heavy like it belonged to someone else, and my chest had this deep soreness that made me breathe shallow without thinking, and I heard myself make a small sound, more like a confused exhale than a word. A nurse appeared in my vision, calm and practiced, hair pulled back, badge swinging slightly as she leaned in, and she said my name in a normal voice, like she was greeting me at the start of a shift, which sounds small, but in that moment it mattered more than anything. Because she said it like I was here, like I had made it. My throat was dry, my tongue felt thick, and when I tried to speak, nothing came out at first, and the nurse put something cold against my lips, a sponge, a small cup. I couldn't tell, and the water tasted like the best thing I'd ever had. Then I turned my head, slowly, and I saw Laura. She was sitting in a chair close to the bed, angled forward like she'd been holding herself in that position for hours, and the first thing I noticed was her eyes. Red, swollen, exhausted. But her face was steady in this almost unnatural way, like she'd taped herself together and was refusing to loosen a single piece. And when she saw me looking at her, her mouth trembled once before she forced it into something that tried to be a smile. "Hey," she said, and her voice was soft, but I could hear the strain in it, the careful control. And I couldn't handle it, because that one syllable contained everything. Fear, relief, anger, love, the exhaustion of a woman who had just watched her husband disappear and wasn't sure he'd come back. My eyes burned, and I felt tears leak out without permission, which was humiliating in the old part of me that still wanted to be tough. But the new part of me didn't care, because I'd just been in that blankness where you realize toughness won't keep you alive. I tried to lift my hand, and it moved an inch, maybe two, shaky and weak, and Laura leaned forward immediately and wrapped her fingers around mine like she was anchoring me to the world. Her hand was warm. That detail hit me like a shock, because warmth is something you don't think about until you've been somewhere without it. "Where's Ethan?" I managed, and the words sounded rough, scraped out of me. Laura swallowed, nodded toward the other side of the room, and that's when I saw him. My son was standing near the wall, arms crossed, trying to look like he didn't know what to do with himself. But his eyes were locked on me in a way I hadn't seen in years, and his face was pale, like he'd been holding his breath since the phone call. He didn't say anything at first. He just stepped closer, slowly, like he wasn't sure I was real, and then he reached out and put his hand on my forearm, awkward and careful, and the pressure was light but certain. That small touch cracked something open in me, because it wasn't a speech. It wasn't drama. It was my kid saying, without words, "I'm here. Don't leave." Try to imagine that moment for a second. The feeling of waking up after your heart stopped, and the first thing you feel is your child's hand on you, as if he's making sure you stay connected to this side of life. A doctor came in later, a man with tired eyes and a calm voice, and he spoke in that direct way doctors do when they've learned not to decorate truth. He told me I'd had a sudden cardiac arrest. He told me it happened in public. He told me an AED was used on me before the paramedics arrived, and that timing mattered more than most people realize. And he said a stranger in the store had done CPR, and followed the AED prompts until EMS got there. A stranger. Someone who owed me nothing. Someone who had looked at my unconscious body on a grocery store floor and decided I was worth saving. The doctor explained that I was lucky, and then he corrected himself. He said, lucky, and warned. Because my numbers, my blood pressure, my risk factors, he listed them like a report I should have read years ago, and he said the line that I still hear at night sometimes. This didn't come out of nowhere. Your body has been trying to tell you. And I wanted to argue out of habit. I wanted to say I was busy, I had responsibilities, I worked hard, I provided. But lying in that bed with wires on my chest and my wife holding my hand like she was afraid to let go, I couldn't pretend anymore. I just nodded. Because for the first time in a long time, I understood that providing isn't the same as being present. And presence is what my family almost lost. The first thing I learned after I woke up is that surviving doesn't automatically make you strong. Sometimes it makes you painfully aware of how fragile you actually are. In the hospital, the days blurred into a routine that was both comforting and humiliating, because people came in and checked my vitals the way you check a machine that might fail again. And I had to ask for help with things I'd never thought about before, like sitting up without getting dizzy, like walking to the bathroom without my heart racing like I'd run a mile. I used to be the guy who carried heavy boxes 2 at a time. Now I was counting steps. And if you've never had your pride dismantled by something as simple as a short hallway, it's hard to explain what that does to your mind, because I kept wanting to rush, to push through, and my body kept answering with this stern, undeniable message. No. Cardiac rehab started as soon as they cleared me, and the name alone sounded like something for older men, the kind of place I'd never imagined myself walking into. And the first time I went, the room was bright and clean, with treadmills lined up like quiet threats, and nurses and therapists moving around with clipboards and calm voices. I felt exposed. I felt like everybody could see the old version of me, the version that thought he was untouchable, and I felt embarrassed that my life now had to be measured in heart rates and medication schedules and tiny increments of progress. But then something happened that I didn't expect. I started to respect the slowness. Not because I enjoyed it, but because slowness forced me to notice things. It forced me to pay attention to my breathing, to the way my chest rose and fell, to the way fear could spike when my pulse climbed. And it taught me that impatience wasn't strength. Impatience was panic wearing a tougher face. Just picture this for a moment. Me, a warehouse operations manager who used to bark orders across a loading dock, now walking on a treadmill at a pace that would have annoyed me in a grocery store aisle, holding the side rails like a cautious old man, sweating from effort that used to be nothing. And then imagine the strange gratitude that started creeping in. Because walking slowly meant I was walking. It meant I was still here. I went home after a week that felt like a month, and the house looked the same, but it didn't feel the same, because I walked through the front door with a new awareness of how close I'd come to never seeing it again. Laura had stocked the fridge like she was rebuilding a life with groceries, not just feeding a family. And there were pill bottles on the counter that made me feel old. And there was a blood pressure cuff sitting next to the toaster like it belonged there. Ethan hovered at first. He didn't know how to talk about what happened, and neither did I, because men in our family weren't exactly raised to sit down and say, I was scared, without immediately trying to cover it with a joke. So we started smaller. I asked him about the games he played, not in that mocking way I used to, but with actual curiosity, and the first time I did it, he looked at me like he was waiting for the punchline. When no punchline came, his shoulders dropped a little. He showed me a screen, explained something complicated, and I listened. Not half listened. Listened. And later that night, when I got tired and had to sit down, he didn't roll his eyes like I expected. He just sat near me on the couch and stayed there, quietly, like proximity was his way of forgiving. I called my dad the next morning. Not after coffee. Not after checking emails. Not after one more thing. I called him first, and when he answered, he sounded surprised in a way that almost broke me. Hey, son, he said, and there was a pause, like he was bracing for the usual quick conversation. I didn't let it be quick. I told him what happened without minimizing it, without turning it into a story that made me look tough. And then I said the words that had been stuck in my throat for years because they felt too vulnerable. I'm sorry I haven't been calling. I kept thinking I had time. There was silence on the line. And then my dad exhaled, slow and shaky, and he said, I'm just glad you're here to say that. Have you ever realized that an apology isn't just about admitting you were wrong, but about giving someone proof that you still care enough to change? Because that phone call wasn't about guilt. It was about returning. I started making small rituals that would have felt silly to the old me. I tracked my blood pressure the way I tracked warehouse metrics. I set reminders for meds. I went to follow-up appointments and asked questions instead of pretending I didn't need help. And at home, I tried to show my love in ways that couldn't be missed, because one of the hardest truths I learned is that love you don't express becomes invisible to the people who need to feel it. But the biggest change, the one that didn't show up on any chart, was how I treated time. I stopped acting like time was something I could bully. I started treating it like something borrowed. Because it is. And once you feel your life almost slip out of your hands in a grocery store aisle, you don't look at ordinary days the same way again. A few weeks after I came home, I went back to that grocery store, not because I needed anything, but because a part of me needed to stand in that aisle and prove to myself that I was still alive. And when I got there, I didn't feel dramatic or brave. I felt quiet. I stood between cereal and frozen pizza and listened to the normal sounds. Carts rolling, a kid laughing somewhere, the distant beep of a register. And I realized how close I'd come to becoming a story someone told once and then slowly stopped telling. I still don't know the stranger's full story. The person who used the AED on me and followed those robotic prompts when my heart had stopped doing its job. But I carry the weight of that kindness every day, because it's a strange thing to owe your life to someone you may never properly thank. And it changed me, not in the loud, motivational poster way, but in the quiet, daily way, the way that actually matters. I don't rush people the way I used to, because now I know the slow person might be fighting something invisible. I call my dad back. I sit with my son even when we're not saying much, because presence counts more than performance. And I tell my wife I love her out loud, not because it's dramatic, but because words don't do any good trapped inside you. So let me ask you something, gently, with no pressure. Have you been ignoring something important in your own body or in your own life because you keep believing you'll handle it later? Just picture this for a moment. If time didn't ask your permission, what would you wish you'd said today? If you still have the chance to say something kind, to make the appointment, to return the call, to sit down and really be there, don't leave it for later. Because later is not promised. And love, I learned the hard way, isn't what you feel. It's what you show up for, consistently, while you still can.